And raw. Welcome to the New Caveman Show. Unless you are a caveman, not a new caveman, you would have heard of the exceptional M1 Max already. Now, if you are on the fence between a M1 MacBook Air or a M1 MacBook Pro, you are not alone. These two are
Same, but different.
So, how do you choose? From the top, when both the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro are shut, they look virtually identical. They occupy the same footprint, thus you are able to use the same laptop casing for both models. The MacBook Air has a tapered wedge design since the day Steve Jobs pulled the first MacBook Air out of a vanilla envelope. The MacBook Pro, on the other hand, is a sleek and uniform aluminum slab. Fun fact, the MacBook Air is actually thicker than the MacBook Pro at its thickest end. When holding the MacBooks, the tapered shape of the MacBook Air actually gives you a better grip and the illusion that it is light and razor thin. In reality, the MacBook Air is only lighter than the MacBook Pro by around 100 grams. For the trackpad, the MacBook Pro features a slightly larger trackpad than the MacBook Air. It is a nice thing to have, the larger trackpad, but I wouldn't use the trackpad as a basis for comparison. For the colors, the MacBook Pro comes only in silver and space gray variants, while the MacBook Air comes with an additional gold variant. If gold is your thing, then the MacBook Air is the only option for you. Now I will talk about the touch bar versus the function keys. Now this is a controversial topic as everyone has differing thoughts on the touch bar of the MacBook Pro. The touch bar replaces the traditional function keys, and in their place, you get various shortcut touch keys depending on the software you are using. Think emojis when using the touch bar in the Message app, or switching tabs when in the Safari app. I'm guessing why people are hating the touch bar in the first place could be because they are not finding the keys that they want by default. Others may find slapping physical keys more satisfying. Personally, I would recommend setting up your touch bar first to save yourself the headaches later on. I also think that the touch bar makes the MacBook Pro looks next gen, while the dedicated function keys of the MacBook Air does look kind of dated. FYI, the dedicated function keys of the MacBook Air has also been updated to include new functions like dictation, spotlight, and do not disturb. Now let's compare the battery life. The roles have reversed now. In the past, MacBook Air boasts greater battery life than the MacBook Pro. Now, the new M1 MacBook Air boasts a battery life of up to 18 hours, and the MacBook Pro gives you up to 20 hours of battery life. If you are always on the go and using your MacBook outside, the MacBook Pro will give you a greater peace of mind. And if you are the sort who wants to future-proof and use your device for many years to come, the larger battery will give you greater mileage as your battery lifespan shortens over the years. Now I will finally talk about performance. Now this will be the most important factor to consider when choosing between the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro. Now both models feature the same M1 chip. So what is the real difference between the performance? The M1 chip of the MacBook Pro has 8 cores GPU, while the M1 chip of the MacBook Air has only 7 cores of GPU. Additionally, the MacBook Air is fanless, while the MacBook Pro has fans to cool the chip actively. In theory, this means that the MacBook Air will tend to thermal throttle compared to the MacBook Pro. However, after testing, we know that the fans of the MacBook Pro only start kicking in after the 10-minute mark. This means that the performance of both models are largely similar, unless you are running heavy tasks for longer than 10 minutes. That means I wouldn't need the MacBook Pro at all. I tried exporting an hour-long 4K video. This time it took 44 minutes. So for such a long and heavy task, the MacBook Pro would have an advantage and give you a faster result. Another obvious use case would be for gaming, since you would most likely game for longer than 10 minutes. Most user-submitted results show that the MacBook Air can mostly run games at medium graphics setting, while the MacBook Pro can let you game at high graphics settings. So, how do you choose? Well, always remember the 80-20 rule. Do you need that extra performance if you are not exporting hour-long 4K videos on a daily basis? Or do you really need the slightly better portability of the MacBook Air if your laptop is always stuck at your desk? Now don't compromise yourself 80% of the time. If gaming is your concern, I highly recommend you get the MacBook Air. Take the cost savings and get yourself a Nintendo Switch or a PS5. The games library on the Mac is not as extensive, so do yourself a favor and get a dedicated gaming machine instead. If performance is your concern, I can assure you that the M1 MacBook Air performs neck to neck with the M1 MacBook Pro, unless the tasks that you are doing exceeds the 10 minutes mark. Try imagining exporting a half-hour long 4K video, for example, or playing games for the matter. That is when thermal throttling will kick in for the lack of cooling fans in the M1 MacBook Air. Next, you need to keep yourself updated on the MacBook rumors. All rumors are pointing towards a redesigned mini LED 14-inch MacBook Pro coming out in 2021. Usually, the hardware redesigns will go to the Pro models first, before trickling down to the lower-end models. Thus, I would say this is the worst time to get the MacBook Pro when the redesign is coming soon in months. It is relatively safe to get a MacBook Air now, as I'm pretty sure it won't be redesigned in the next 2 years. Even so, the low cost of the M1 MacBook Air will make it less painful to trade in and upgrade. With all said, these are my thoughts when deciding between the M1 MacBook Pro and the M1 MacBook Air. In the end, I chose the M1 MacBook Air because it is more affordable, it performs neck to neck with the M1 MacBook Pro most of the time, and lastly, I'm actually looking forward to the redesigned MacBook Pro in 14-inch. The MacBook Air can serve as a transitional device for me. I hope you have enjoyed my video. Please ask me any questions in the comment section. Do help me out by clicking the subscribe button. Stay safe everyone. Bye bye.